welcome everybody to this Spotlights event. My name's Andrea Coomber. It's my great privilege to be the Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform. Sorry, just a note popped up in my chat. I'm going to close that. We are really thrilled that you've chosen to join us this Wednesday lunchtime. It is approaching summertime here in the UK, and we're all planning our kind of holiday trips and rest period over August. And the next hour, we're going to do a bit of a holiday trip, a tour of Europe and across the Atlantic to the US to talk about what's happening in criminal justice and what lessons there may be for England and Wales from other parts of Europe and North America. Just a little bit quickly from me on context. I mean, we now find ourselves in England and Wales 13 years, in fact, in Britain, 13 years into a government which has had a strong austerity regime, where there's been a lot of retrenchment of public funding from the criminal justice system. Although I have to say that retrenchment began in previous iterations of government also. So we've had nearly 30 years of cutbacks of legal aid, of court hours, of money being short. We've had the more recent challenge presented by COVID, and we now find ourselves in a kind of strange place where we have a particular crisis in our criminal justice system, which spans from confidence in the police all the way through to CPS charging practices. Oh gosh, my computer's just said I don't have, oh no, my computer's got no charge. Hopefully my team can jump in if I disappear. We have a lack of confidence, I think, across the system. We particularly now have a challenge in our prison system. Our prisons have 86,000 people in them, plus another 500 children. The trajectory is to have 106,000 people in prison by 2027. And there is a very strong law and order, tough on crime, public political discourse. Sentences have been getting longer and longer for an ever longer list of offences for over 20 years. And in sort of this week, we find ourselves with overcrowded prisons, understaffed prisons where people have no regime, no education. They're locked in cells for 20, 23 hours a day. Mental health appears to be at an all-time low. And when people are released, there are very high rates of them reoffending, having really not been able to do anything that would encourage sort of rehabilitation of any sort inside prison. So that is our pretty depressing sort of context in England and Wales. I'm not completely depressed about it. I think there's lots of opportunities for improvement. The only way really appears to be up at this stage. But it would be really great to hear from our panel about, first of all, we're going to do a quick tour de table to find out where they're from and where their expertise is in before we start a conversation. But it'd be great to learn from each one of you. So I'll ask Hindpal to start.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Andrea, and hello, everyone. Yeah, so my background is I work at the Inspectorate of Prisons. So primarily I go around prisons, but also immigration detention, and my main role is to look at treatment conditions of prisoners there. I also do I'm one of those annoying people who does bits and bobs around different prison systems too. So I've done bits of work, inspection or research, consultancy in various other prison systems around the world, and I'm hoping I can both learn something and also maybe contribute something from that experience, as well as talking about England and Wales today.
Terrific. Louise.
Hi, and thank you also so much for the invitation. So I am an academic at the University of Strathclyde, and there I'm researching Magdalen laundries, which I think might not seem immediately relevant to this conversation, but this was like Ireland's main system of incarceration in the 20th century, which was completely abolished. And so I'm sort of interested in how does a system of mass incarceration come into existence, but also how does it demise? And I've also studied the history of prison policy in Ireland and Scotland. But before that, I have sort of a long track record in penal reform. One of my first jobs was working sort of as a lowly intern at the Irish Penal Reform Trust, an incredible organisation, and learned so much there. And then when I came to Scotland, I was the Policy and Public Affairs Manager of the Herald League Scotland and the co-founding member of SPARC, which is the Scottish Prisoner Advocacy and Research Collective.
Great. Now, I apologise that our next presenter you can't actually see, but Vinny's just struggling. But joining us at an early hour from New York, do you want to introduce yourself, Vinny?
Yeah, I'm Vinny Schiraldi. I'm actually much taller than I look right now. Currently I'm the Secretary of Juvenile Services in Maryland. I'm actually in one of my correctional facilities that, as you're aware, they don't always have such great internet connections. And I've had kind of three different parts to my career. I started in nonprofits. I founded the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice in San Francisco and the Justice Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. I've been in government. I was head of corrections in New York City, which means I ran Rikers Island. I was commissioner of probation in New York City under Mayor Bloomberg. I ran the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services in Washington, D.C. And now I'm running juvenile services for Maryland. And then in between all of that, I spent some years at Harvard in the Kennedy School and at Columbia, founding the Columbia Justice Lab, researching, writing, and teaching about mass incarceration. Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited about the panel.
Sorry, we can't see you, Vinny, but we look forward to hearing from you, if not seeing you. And finally, Jana.
Oh, thank you very much. It's my honor and pleasure to be today with you and with this amazing panelists. So my name is Jana Spero, and I am a Secretary General of Confederation of European Probation, which is the largest European umbrella network organization that is for professionals in probation, but in the criminal justice field also. We are connecting professionals in Europe to talk more about how to raise awareness about working with the offenders in the community and about professionalization of probation work and tasks. In my personal background, I'm a lawyer. I am from Croatia, where I started my career, and I worked 17 years in the Ministry of Justice, always involved in the criminal justice field. One of my really big and important achievements is that I was one of the people who were developing a probation service in Croatia, because it's still a young service. So I was there at the beginning, and I passed all the steps from working with the probation offenders in the field to becoming a national director for the probation service. After some time, we had the merge of prison and probation service, and for the 5 years, I was Director General for all probation and all prison service in the Republic of Croatia. And from that position, I moved to the international waters, to the Confederation of European Probation. I also have a long history of working as an expert for European Union, for UN, and for Council of Europe as expert in different projects in Europe. So I hope that with this experience, I will be able to contribute to the topics that you mentioned, Andrea.
Terrific, thank you. We look forward to hearing from you all. And before we, I'm going to go to Hindpal to talk a little bit about, perhaps a bit more in detail about England and Wales. But just for our audience, just to note that this is an event that's being recorded. So the link to it will be sent to you at the end to everybody who's RSVP'd and will be available to watch. In the chat box, unfortunately, we can't see you all, but do say who you are and why you're here and what you're interested in the chat box if you like, and share your thoughts on the proceedings. If you have a question, please put that into the question and answer box. We won't be checking the chat box for questions. So questions into the question and answer box. We have a few questions we're going to talk about as a panel, but then the floor will very much be open for you to ask questions of our panelists. So please these things always seem to work out that there are no questions initially, and then by 10 to the end of the hour, there's a list and we can't get through them all. So first in, first served. There we go. Hindpal, do you want to? I mean, my initial introduction was a bit grim. Does that sound about right to you?
Well, listen, I'll try and cheer you up a bit, but I don't think I'll succeed very well. I think, you know, if you're looking at some of the key issues in the prison system in England and Wales at the moment, overcrowding is the key problem. You know, so overcrowding affects absolutely everything else. And whenever we go around prisons, you know, we're seeing a lack of activity. We're seeing classrooms empty, jobs not being provided, you know, workshops are empty as well. So overcrowding, I think, you know, fundamentally affects everything, partly because there isn't enough activity or rehabilitative work provided for prisoners, but also because it affects staff. You know, and I think this is something we don't talk about enough. You know, staff don't want to go to work and do nothing but unlock and lock doors. They're often, you know, fired up by the possibility of doing rehabilitative work, of, you know, really getting alongside people and doing some of the difficult work that the research shows us works. So desistance is about forming relationships. It's about making sure you get to know people. It's seeing people regularly. You know, it's getting under the skin of, you know, someone's offending, but also, you know, trying to, you know, understand a bit more about their personality, and compensating for the fact that, you know, people in prison often are quite difficult to relate to. And I think we need to understand that, you know, we have a prison population which has got huge concerns around mental health. You know, neurodiversity, I think, is being understood better than it has ever before, but the research is still pretty much around the UK and the US, as far as I know. And we're only beginning, I think, to understand the impact of neurodiversity on, you know, what happens in prisons. You know, one thing actually which always strikes me is brain injury, which I knew absolutely nothing about. And I never cease to be shocked by the huge number of people in prison who have got brain injuries, which affect their ability to relate, affect their decision-making, and affect, you know, not just what they do in prison, but what they do once they're released. And I don't think staff have the time, the ability to really understand, you know, these diverse problems that prisoners face, and therefore, you know, do the kind of difficult work at assistance, which we can see in some other systems. So you know, one of the places I've been to recently is Norway, and I know Norway gets a lot of stick for being too different and too rich and all those things, but I think we'd be pretty foolish for if we didn't take some of the lessons which places like Norway can give us. And so there you have, you know, very well-trained prison staff who can do things which are inspiring, you know, which motivate them and which are useful to prisoners. We have small-scale prisons, you know, located in communities. You know, it's very community-based. And, you know, I know we're a long way away from that right now in England and Wales, but, you know, why not try to think about how we can integrate that kind of thinking into our vision for the future? You know, I can't really see a good reason not to do that. Yeah, and prison numbers, you know, you mentioned, Andrea, that, you know, the numbers are going to go up. 106,000 by 2027 is the top line figure. That is crazy large. I mean, that's you know, really, really difficult to deal with. Right now, you know, one of the biggest problems is that everywhere we go, you know, the worst outcomes are in the area of work, education, and other activity. You know, and you can't, sometimes I think it's hard to avoid the conclusion that systems under pressure see activity and rehabilitative work as being the two dispensable things. So, you know, when COVID-19 hit, you know, prisons across the world dispensed with those things. Whenever prisons are under pressure, they start dispensing with activity and rehabilitative work. It's absolutely critical to, you know, a purposeful, useful system where people can move forwards, where you have motivated staff, motivated prisoners, and, you know, a system which can actually make a difference to reoffending rates. So I think we have to look, you know, very seriously at how we can, and get some lessons as well from other countries about how we can start to reduce prison populations so that staff have more time to focus to understand the complexities of the people they're working with. And there are some examples around Europe, again, looking to the Nordic countries. Finland very impressively has reduced its prison population from being the highest in Europe to being pretty much the lowest now. And they did that through a very clear sense of purpose. They decided that having so many people in prison was an abnormal state of affairs. It wasn't something which we should just shrug our shoulders at and say, well, look, the courts are sending them there and therefore there's nothing we can do about it. They thought, well, how can we realistically and creatively change the narrative? And I think events like this, hopefully we'll have more events like this, can help to start changing that narrative, getting people to think more creatively about how things can be done differently. Have I used up my time?
That's fantastic. Maybe we should start close and then we'll spread out. Louise?
Well, I feel like I have an optimistic example, but sort of for England to replicate this might be a mountain to climb, and maybe that will be the slightly like dour dose of realism. But when I started my research on prisons in Ireland from the 1970s, I sort of understood it to have been, well, not much happened there and it wasn't very innovative and prison numbers went up and fine. But actually what happened was, yes, prison numbers went up because crime was rising in Ireland, but inside the prison division, the prison policy people, the people who are sort of making all the decisions, they just saw the idea of prison numbers going up. In a similar case, as Hindpal was saying, to Finland, they just thought that was kind of appalling because their fundamental understanding was that people who stay in prison too long become vegetative. People who stay in prison too long are leaving families, children, or jobs, that their communities become destabilized. And they also thought, well, the prison in and of itself, therefore, is personally, on a communal level and sort of socially, so destructive. And so they thought, well, the thing to do, they're not radicals. They accepted that people require prison for a sense of catharsis, for justice. But their idea was, well, if someone's in prison, they've been sent to prison. But actually, they decided to just very much, I want to say radicalize, but really liberalize the use of temporary release. So they'd accept people into prison, but they just basically opened it up the back door. And how those decisions were made were how the people in the prison administration would be ringing the prison, or prison governors would ring the prison administration and say, this guy has a job, and this is also a time when unemployment was really high in Ireland. They'd say, can't make a man unemployed, give him a criminal record, but like deprive him of liberty, crazy. And so they would make these decisions on a case-by-case basis. So I think the sort of example here is to what that sort of like quirky historical episode teaches is that, well, the fundamental issue in Ireland is they saw the problem was not to deal with the prisoner or their sort of offending behavior primarily. The problem was to address the sort of inescapably tragic nature of the prison. If you were sort of skeptical the prison is going to sort of yield some social good by extending numbers or increasing sentences, you think it's fundamentally more and more destructive the more people you have in there, then that really opens your mind to do more liberal and more interesting sort of policies and procedures. But also how they ran the system was not on risk units, it was not on metrics. They really were connected to, people I spoke to said we just felt very connected to the human stories of the prisoners. And that's not the prison officers, that's the people in government making policy. So it's somehow, the more bureaucracy we have, the more we dehumanize prisoners. It's very hard to create a system like that. But that's an Irish example. There's great humanity about the system.
That's terrific. Vinny, early observations?
Yes, I'll try to be a little optimistic too, although, our incarceration rates and our rates of what I call mass supervision in the United States are off the hook in terms of, comparisons to UK and Europe and other parts of the world, generally 5 to 10 times higher. I've practiced in a lot of places. I'll talk a little about New York City, which I think was, in my view, pretty extraordinary by US standards. At one point, I did some calculations and discovered that New York City would be a mediocre EU country, which by US standards is pretty extraordinary because the US itself has got an incarceration rate, 5 to 10 times EU countries typically. And so in the mid 90s, New York, I'll focus on Rikers Island since I ran that. US has this complicated jail, prison stuff going on, but what I'm saying about Rikers Island is pretty true of the number of people New York City was also sending to state prisons as well. We dropped from 22,000 a peak in 1992 down to when I took over Rikers Island in 2021, down to 5,400, which by was a 3/4 decline. During that time, we had dramatic drops in both reported crime and arrests, which are not always associated in the US because sometimes you just arrest a lot of people for drug crimes or misdemeanors or turnstile jumping or things like that. I'll measure that is often considered very reliable as homicides because that's not affected very much by arrest. And so we dropped from 2,200 in the mid 90s when our jail population was also peaking, down to below 300 before the pandemic. Again, by comparison, London about the same time hovered between 90 to 100 homicides, so nothing to brag about by international standards, but by US standards, that was pretty damn dramatic. During this time, a lot of things were happening. We were bolstering public defense, we're adding social work staff to our defender offices so they could argue for alternatives to incarceration, and we were increasing funding to non-governmental organizations who were supporting people in lieu of incarceration or after incarceration. And I think what was happening was a sort of virtual cycle was occurring, that as crime went down, city leaders got more willing to fund alternatives to incarceration and programs. Judges and prosecutors were more willing to try different options out as that occurred, and it was studied and there were good outcomes. Crime, and crime went down, incarceration went down. So it was just sort of cycle. It's hard to know what was the chicken and what was the egg. One example was New York had very harsh drug sentencing mandatories that were launched by progressive Republican Rockefeller during the 70s, right around when President Nixon was declaring a war on crime and tying that to efforts to peel off concerned Southern and Northern suburban voters, right? So there's this war on crime, war on drugs gets launched, very racialized in a way that is specifically targeted at Southern whites and Northern suburban whites. Very successful. Nixon won overwhelmingly. And that really is in US circles thought of as the beginning of the launch to mass incarceration. So Rockefeller, who has presidential aspirations, gets these Rockefeller drug laws passed, and drug sentencing explodes in New York prisons. But what started to happen in the 90s was that it was becoming illegitimate in the eyes of system players. It was just too punitive. People were going to prison for life sentences for first offense drug cases. And so the system started to work around it, including the prosecutors, which is very interesting. And they started to divert people by just not charging them with crimes that would kick in the mandatory, and saying, if you go to this treatment program and you do well, we just won't ever charge you with the mandatory. And Joe Hines, the Brooklyn prosecutor, we have 5 prosecutors in 5 boroughs in New York, did that at first. The research showed much lower rates of recidivism, of course, much lower rates of incarceration, big money savings. All 5 prosecutors started doing that, and then they started doing it around the rest of the state. So that's just one example of how that virtuous cycle played itself out. US still has a very long way to go. And now with a spike in crime and some forms of crime, by the way, not all types of crime, in some jurisdictions, people are starting to shade back towards the punitive times. A population of Rikers is now above 6,000. It was 5,400 when I took over in 2021. So there's some alarming signs as well. It's not a purely rosy story, but that was pretty damn impressive. And there's some stories like that in other parts of the country, San Francisco, Massachusetts, and an overall decline in incarceration in the US. I wouldn't make too much of that overall decline in incarceration because it has not kept up with the overall decline in crime. So you're actually more likely per offense to go to prison today than you were even at the peak. But frankly, crime has been coming down since the mid-90s, and incarceration didn't start coming down until 2009. So it was a lot worse from the mid-90s.
I mean, it's good to know that it's possible. That is a hopeful message. Jana.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I'm representing International Probation Family. So whenever we talk about criminal justice field, it's very important to highlight the importance of the probation service and of the professionals working with the offenders in the community. We strongly believe in Confederation of European Probation that we can contribute to safer communities with a good rehabilitation and the reintegration of offenders. And this would be with having professionals who do the interventions. This is how we reduce reoffending, and this is how we impact the crime. We can all agree that we will always have people who need to be in prison, but there are many crimes that actually can be, the punishment can be served in the community. And from what we can see, the reoffending rates are better for the community when persons do make a change when working on the probation. So we already heard about the Scandinavia and about their approach. So they have this saying, if nothing changes, nothing changes. So the first thing we need to think about is how to work treatment with every offender. How do we tackle all these issues that were first there that made people commit a crime? And then when the crime is committed, we need to think about carefully, is this person for a prison and everything that comes with imprisonment, or could this be something for the community measure and sanctions? I can tell you from my personal experience that when we had a really big overcrowding in prisons in the Republic of Croatia, this was the moment when we decided that we want to have a professional probation service. And actually what we did is that we changed the law in order to have more community-based sanctions. And we had a lot of workshops to talk with the judges and the prosecutors. And we really trained our staff to be professionals and to be able to work with the different types of crime, like mental health issues, sexual violence, domestic violence, gender-based violence. And when you show this level of professionality, then you can expect the other stakeholders in the criminal justice to be aware and to make this difference. So in the Republic of Croatia, we really lowered the number of prisoners by having a professional probation service. On the other hand, for the many countries in Europe that have a long history of both prison and probation service, for example, I don't know if you know, but this year is in the Netherlands celebrated as 200 years of the probation service. So it's a long, long history. It's the same in England. You also have a very long tradition of the probation service. So now it's all the question of stopping the net widening, because we have to see the number of the crime that is committed and the number of people that are in the prison and in the probation service. And if the numbers are more than that, it means that we have to think about it, that maybe not everyone is to be punished. So we need to keep this criminal justice system for the people that really are a threat for our society, because in the end, what we want to have a good neighbors. Every offender in Europe will tomorrow be our neighbor. So we want to do everything in order to have a good neighbors tomorrow.
Yeah, I think that net widening thing is something we're acutely aware of, that while we're putting the case for less use of prison, we don't want that to mean that we push people into more supervision and all of the stress and resource and everything that at one stage we just need to stop punishing and defer punishment and decide that punishment isn't going to be the answer. Louise, I wonder if there's, I mean, both Hindpal and Jana have talked about staffing and kind of professionalizing staffing. Is that something you've seen in Ireland? Is that sort of...
Well, certainly, I'm not so up to date with what goes on in Ireland now, but after this sort of case in the 1970s, the things that made it really run aground was real union troubles around pay. That is like maybe a case for another day. But in Scotland now, we have quite a good system of training prison officers, and I guess the idea is, and I see someone in the questions ask a question about social work, and I guess a prison officer is a prison officer in the way a prison is a prison, but actually the way in which these things are conducted from one place to the next like differs massively in the sense of like, well, what do prison officers think this work is kind of like? So say they're trying to make it in Scotland, they think it as, yes, there is an element of security, locking doors, moving people around, but actually to make them think of it primarily more as a kind of social work. So you see a lot now in the policy documents, rather than saying prisoners and confinement, they'll say people in our care. And so the billing of a Scottish prison officer would be, you know, help with the well-being and care of people. So I guess time will tell how successful that's been in embedding on the ground. But I sort of admire the ambition to say, to try and reorient what it is that prison officers do, and also to try and say, well, this is like a meaningful long-term career, and it's something that it's like something like lifelong learning, like social work.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that when we talk to, we've got members who are prison officers and they will be on this call, and we talk to them, you know, it's a job that people do go into because they want to make a difference, engage. And I think that's one of the frustrations now when we have too many people and not enough staff, is those opportunities for that become more limited. And so people are just feeling like they're spending their time banging people up and doing the kind of very bare minimum, which means that the job is less rewarding, and then we have people leave. It's complicated. Vinny, in New York, how much is staffing when you were running Rikers Island? And presumably that's a rather large workforce, but to what extent were issues of staffing for the forefront of your mind?
Yes, it was a crazy part of the issues, and we had 8,400 uniformed staff to go along with our 5,400 incarcerated people. So we had an extraordinarily high number of staff, but morale was so low and violence was so high that on any given day, about a third of our staff was out sick, and another pretty large proportion of our staff was on light duty and unable to work with people who were incarcerated. So we had people working double and triple shifts, which further, of course, eroded morale. And so that was really heartbreaking. It was a truly heartbreaking job, both for the staff and for the incarcerated people. And I think it's a good example of how when you don't sort of take care of your staff, then kind of nothing else is going to go right. That you can't improve conditions for incarcerated people unless the people who come to work every day feel respected, feel honored, feel safe, and able to do their jobs.
We've got some great questions already in the chat. Should we start having a look at some of them? So I'm afraid Hugh's question is the awful question, which is about why this country is so bloody punitive. And I think there is something about England and punishment and incarceration. I mean, as others of you may have heard me say, I speak with this accent because 7 generations ago, my ancestors committed crime and got transported to Australia by way of punishment. And that's why I have an Australian accent. But I think it is pretty ingrained in the DNA of this country. I mean, is it the same in the countries you're from? I mean, there is a really strong sense of like we need to really punish people, that they've harmed us and therefore we will harm them. That doesn't seem to me the Irish way, surely, Louise, or the Scottish way. It's probably the Scottish way.
Well, you know, I've spoken plenty about Ireland. I'm going to say about Scotland because, you know, when I worked for the Howard League in Scotland, I think like people from sort of a previous generation of the Howard League England would come up and visit ministers and say, what you're doing here is so fantastic. How can we repeat this in England? Well, what we were saying was, well, what you're doing here in Scotland is pretty terrible. Can you stop doing it? So there's an interesting contrast here about lesson learning. But what I think they admired so much about what happens here in Scotland is what I used to think of as the civility around the prison system. So there's a very measured political discourse. I mean, our Tory party here is, you know, they love an outrageous soundbite, and that is kind of what they're going for. So I'm not saying it's completely divorced of that, but there is, as I said, there's a thing in the policy documents. We talk about prisons as places of care. We're talking about prison officers as people who might be closer to social workers who are supporting people, developing people. This is a really appealing rhetoric, and I think saying rhetoric makes it seem disingenuous, which I don't think it is. I think people are really well-meaning. I think we've had some really well-meaning ministers for justice, and you know, higher up the First Minister at various different points. But our prison population is the same as England. In fact, I think we're at 141 per 100,000. You've just overtaken us at 143. But Scotland has been higher than England for decades. And at the moment in Scotland, 25% of our prison population are remand. The majority of those people will not receive a sentence. That is a scandal. So how could we end overcrowding? Send out the people who are not convicted. It just undermines, you know.
The same here, it's 18% here.
So you could just open the door and do something like that. And I think, as Jana was saying about probation and bail and all sorts of schemes like that. But I think that as in Scotland, we have the same problems, but it seems to sort of temper it because we don't seem as punitive. And I think because in Scotland,
because it's more pleasant, because it's more polite. Is that what you're saying? That it's presentational rather than
I think I consider it like quite civilized. It's a civilized discourse, a civilized way of discussing it. And part of that is also paid the nationalist tension about seeming more progressive than England. But the rhetoric and the policy is progressive. We send just as many people to prison. You know, we have the presumption against short sentences, which I think is worth talking about, is important, but that has not reduced our overall prison population.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Hindpal mentioned Norway, and it often is one of those things where people dismiss Norway, like, oh, that's just Scandinavia. You know, they're running in and out of their saunas and all the prison officers have degrees, like it's just this other world. But I mean, and certainly talking to senior stakeholders, I've definitely had the like, you know, oh, countries like, you know, the Netherlands and Germany, they don't have serious criminals like we have. And you think, what are you talking about? Jana, is there something, I mean, the kind of votes in tough on crime, flog them, beat them, throw away the key, is that part of not a very European thing for mainland Europe?
Well, not in many countries. I think that a lot of countries do believe in rehabilitation and the second chances, but of course with the assistance of professionals, because this is the key issue with the probation service, that they have these two hats, and one is a control and the second one is assistance. So this is what is important. It's not just assistance, because just assistance would be like a typical social work and the social welfare, and just the control would be more like a police type of work. But something in between these two is a probation service, and I believe that the best thing that we can do is show the numbers. And unfortunately, many times media only talks about negative cases, but it's also important to raise awareness of all the benefits that are happening in the probation field and also with the treatment in prisons. So having said that, is why a lot of people do believe in the second chances. But of course, there are still countries that really prefer prison to probation. probation because they think it's more strong, that this is more a loud way to say we don't like that you committed a crime. But actually, the thing that needs to be important for decision makers is what happens after. So what is the rate of recommitting a crime? And if we see that then alternatives have a good way to change people, then I think this is the most important thing we have to say out loud.
I'm going to come to Hindpal because I know you've got a book coming out and it covers how other people deal with prison. Have you reflected on this in your book writing job?
So the book's called What's the Purpose of Prison? And I soon realised I haven't got an answer. It's very tricky to pin that one down. But I was interested in this in a discussion about what is punishment, and I think one of the things we obviously need to work on in this country is thinking about punishment as not necessarily following the prison paradigm every time. And I think Jan has made some very good points about probation. I should confess I used to be a probation officer many years ago, and so I have a real sort of affinity for probation work and real desire for probation to be a stronger disposal. In this country, unfortunately, we used to have a very strong probation service. I think it was quite coherent, had a strong culture. It was changed some years back. The probation service was split, and now it's being unified again. And unfortunately, though, that's a lot of staff have left. The morale went down, and we're finding it very, very difficult indeed to recapture what probation used to have before in terms of its strength of principle and culture. So, if we're going to reduce prison populations and give an alternative to prison through community sanctions, we need to think very clearly. I agree totally with Jana about what the probation service can offer, and maybe turning our gaze more towards the probation service, but also towards community, other forms of community involvement. One of the places I went to a few years ago was Japan, and I was incredibly impressed by the fact that they have a smallish number of probation officers, but 50 times more probation volunteers who do incredible work in supporting people out in the community and helping them to stay out of prison. And they're reoffending. I mean, there are many things to say about the Japanese prison system, which we won't have time to go into here, but I think their reoffending rate is quite impressive. It's quite low, and that has at least something, I think, to do with the fact that the probation system and the community-based system is very strong there.
Right, thank you. We'll come to Gemma Palmer's question. She wants to ask the panel, I'll start with you, Vinny, about what they think the impact of decriminalisation of drugs would have on prison, particularly for issues of overcrowding Hindpal's mentioned. And does the panel think that England and Wales would be out to redirect the conversation around reform of criminal justice, recognise the benefits of decriminalisation, especially given the backlash recently in Scotland? So maybe we'll come to you, Louise. Vinny, drugs, are there lots of people in prison in the US on drugs offences as there are here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really kind of, as the advocates in the United States started to try to roll back, some of the crazy mass incarceration we've been experiencing, drug law reform was really the kind of tip of the spear, if you will, that helped achieve some tangible results. I mean, the mandatory sentences were so absolutely crazy that they were, once advocates got sophisticated about their messaging and polling and focus grouping was done and a lot of philanthropies kicked in money, it was, people were able to use that as a vehicle to get laws changed. And now people, the number of people locked up for drug offenses is really substantially declined in the US, so much so that the groups like the Sentencing Project are talking about shortening very long sentences for violent offenders because they realize we can't undo mass incarceration unless we do that. But still, a lot of the public that doesn't pay very close attention thinks that the majority of people in our prisons are in for drug offenses, which is absolutely no longer true, but helps the advocacy because people think that they're less serious offenses than they really are. So I think that's a good decriminalization, or even if still criminal, reduction of punishments, capturing of savings, and moving those into drug treatment and drug prevention has been a winning. That's been a winning argument in the US and may do so in the UK.
Thanks. Louise, on the Scottish experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the backlash, as I understand it, has been sort of on the political end, is because how this issue from the SNP has got tangled basically into constitutional politics. Like, it's another way to push forward the SNP agenda for independence, another way to show how they are sort of hemmed in by Westminster, which you might say is, well, maybe they are hemmed in by Westminster if they can't decriminalise. But I sort of, building on the back of what Vinny said there, I think it used to be spoken about a lot here and obviously in the US as well, about how decriminalizing drugs is this silver bullet. But I think now the problems of our prison systems and the size of populations is it would require numerous policy fixes. So decriminalizing drugs, ending remand populations. And I was just reflecting, I can't believe I forgot to mention this, but like very briefly, when you work in penal reform, as you know, Andrea, it's small incremental victories. It's very hard to sort of come home from work and say, whoa, that's a big win for penal reform. But in about 2015, Scotland had broken ground. We're going to build our first women's super prison. And so we launched a campaign. We met with ministers. We were writing op-eds for newspapers, and we felt we're getting some support, but say, do not build this prison. You know, you build, it's a classic thing. So you build it, they will come, judges will send women here, fine. And then we decided to change tack and to approach various other groups, such as various women's groups, various nationalist groups, various campaigners, to build a coalition of support for people who weren't necessarily interested in the prison, but is to attach this idea of decarceration to sort of other national projects, so women's rights, or like Independent Scotland, or people campaigning for social justice in other areas. And then it became sort of impossible for the ministers who are also in the SNP and are also sort of coveting women's votes to say, well, we're going to build a super prison, but we want social justice. We're also going to have this large prison. So it stopped lining up, and that prison was cancelled, and they moved on. They've built smaller units, and so it's kind of one small case. I don't think I'll ever have that again. We could stop a huge prison being built, but it was because we attached it to this other image of what the future of this society could be, that spoke to people's other sensibilities about what their society would be like. So yes, we need to decriminalize things, but you also need to think of it in this bigger picture, well, how we can speak to other people's ideas about what's wrong in society and what they would like it to be like, and show how reducing a prison population is such a fundamental part of creating a fairer, more equal, healthier society.
I think that's also picked up in a comment in the chat. I'm not sure if it was to everybody, but it's from Joanne talking about the relationship between childhood trauma and drugs. And I think that goes back to that kind of trying to understand better, you know, who is in prison and what they're in prison for, and that humanizing thing that Hindpal was talking about at the beginning. We're running out of time. That's what happens at these things. A question maybe to start with you, Vinny, and maybe to Jana, about David Buick's question, sorry. And my sense is that many countries, with the notable exception of us and France, brought down their prison population in COVID and haven't seen them rise again. Is that the case? It's a good factual question. Vinny, lots of places in America took people out of prison, the States took people out of prison during the pandemic. Have those prison numbers gone up? The same in mainland Europe?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the US data lagged so far behind because we're so many different jurisdictions. We're not just one place. So usually it's several years old. But in the areas I know, like New York in particular, the numbers dropped to the below 4,000, and then they're back up above 6,000 now. So yeah, I think that has been happening, and it's a little difficult to argue. Like initially, you could argue that when the populations went down, there wasn't really a rise in crime, but now crime has come back up. I don't think it's connected necessarily to the decline in the incarcerated populations. I think it's, you know, all the drama and trauma that goes along with the pandemic. But one could argue that as incarceration fell, crime rose, and it wouldn't be totally implausible. So that's a blow for the movement, I think.
Yeah, that's not a great message, Jenny.
Yeah, no, it's not a great message. Hey, one thing in the chat that was mentioned was formerly incarcerated people and the role that really helped when formerly incarcerated people had a more important voice in the movement in the United States, and they were humanized in ways that they had been dehumanized in the ramp up to mass incarceration. That really helped efforts to reduce incarceration.
Yeah. Jana?
Well, I can say that in different European countries, the different practice was during the COVID. For example, in Portugal, there was a new law that really helped them to make prisons less, to have less prisoners during the COVID. On the other hand, in my home country of Croatia, we didn't have that. So the numbers during the COVID were pretty equal to the pre-COVID time. When it comes to numbers after the COVID, I think that we can see a little bit of increase of prisoners all around. But I would suggest for everyone who attends this panel, maybe to check the Council of Europe web pages. I don't know if you're aware of the SPACE statistics. It's a statistics that shows SPACE 1 is for prison and SPACE 2 for the probation services, where you can see the Council of Europe member states and the rates of prisoners and the offenders under the probation service from year to year. It's always published. So then it's easy to compare the numbers.
Thank you. And that's a great reference. Maybe Rob could actually pull that up and put it in the chat for people, the link. We're running out of time. That's what happens at these things. It's a disaster. What we really need to do, actually, I'll talk to the staff about this afterwards, is maybe have just a series where we go deep on one particular country and lessons from that country, because there's so much here. I think maybe we have one question, one more question. And there are too many here. Let's see. I mean, well, let's go to the last bit of Jonathan's question, which is about, you know, how we move the dial on punishment and particularly getting rid of prison. And is they're like, he's asked for a magic bullet, a spear, or even a pea shooter. That would be, maybe I'll go to each one of you for kind of one thing that we could do that as a kind of movement that would start to move the dial. Louise, can I start with you?
Okay, one thing that will start to move.
Pea shooter, he's not after much.
I really think, just because I've done so much comparative work and historical work, and I've looked at prisons change over time and across nations, and the thing for me that seems absolutely fundamental is to have an inbuilt skepticism of the prison. The idea that the prison is socially destructive. The problem should always be the prison, not fundamentally prison or their offending behavior, that the prison itself is criminogenic. And once you start becoming skeptical of the prison, it becomes implausible, sort of unfathomable to expand it. And I think the societies that have, don't want to just get caught into this like low and high prison numbers, but humane prison systems are tolerant of the idea that sometimes people slip up, people make mistakes. And someone mentioned earlier in the questions about punitiveness. It's not just the desire to punish, it's the unwillingness to understand or to forgive. And just like one tiny example from like a policy document in Ireland in the 1980s called What is Rehabilitation? I said, listen, it's a snazzy new term and we really believe in it and it seems great, but it's not about reoffending. If someone leaves the prison and they're a better husband, they're a better father, they hold down a job for longer than they have before, but they rob a car, that's a success. We should not judge success on offending, but on the idea that people are change as a process, and we have to understand people as people, not just as units and statistics and figures. That's a huge amount to climb. That's a sort of shift in cultural conception, but it's also why it's so important, as people have said already, to get those human stories into the public narrative.
Great, thank you. Vinny?
You know, I think
What's your pea shooter?
pardon me?
What's your spear? What's your one thing?
You know, I think that there's been a lot of very substantial reduction in incarceration in the US from an incredibly high number to just a very high number, but still pretty substantial declines, including pretty conservative places. You know, President Trump signed the First Step Act. The numbers of people incarcerated plummeted after that. A lot of people were moved out of prison into halfway houses, and their recidivism rates were stunningly low. So there are some good examples from the bad United States of America on this issue of how you really could reduce incarceration. And there are a lot of conservative spokespeople who are willing to talk to people in other countries. So use us as an example of what not to do, and also occasionally of some areas of hope. I think there are some decent examples. And I put a bunch of readings in the chat if folks want to check them out.
Terrific. Jana?
Well, we all have to think about the prevention as a first phase, how we have a society with less crime. But if the crime already happened, then we need to be sure that we have a criminal justice system that has both prison and probation service, and that we have a staff that is well trained, that knows how to work with the offenders. Because if we work with them in any of these two regimes, if we really do good work, we have a good chance of a good change.
And finally, Hindpal, back to home.
Yeah, I think that well, I agree with most of what's been said, but for me, I think, probably the most important thing is to start to think about ways to cross the divides. We need to start recognizing that many of the people, the public isn't as punitive as we think they are. I think the research shows that. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who are affected by crime in high crime neighborhoods have people who want prison. It's useful for them. They want people taken off the streets, even if it's only for a short time. And I think if we have these debates which are talking to people who are already converted, then I think we have a problem. So I think maybe think about how we can connect with those people who are in those neighborhoods, who perhaps see a value in the prison which we don't, from a bit of a distance, and work out how to really intensify the debate and to have a respectful and open debate and listen to the other side.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm afraid that our hour is up, and that's ridiculous. So please, you can't see everybody else clapping, but I'm going to clap our panelists, Louise, Vinny, Hindpal, and Jana. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. I think we really need to dig down with each one of you about your different jurisdictions, so we'll think about doing that. Thank you to our audience for coming along and sharing their afternoon with us, and for those of you who are watching this back on pre-record. We're going to take a break for the summer from Spotlights, but we'll be back in September, October, I think, with more. There's been a lot for us to pick up on, and frankly, as someone who's leading a penal reform charity, I've been taking notes of lots of things that we really need to kind of readjust and tinker our approaches to. So thank you to our panelists very much. Thank you to all the questions and for your support. If you're not a member of the Howard League, please sign up and become one. It's a good thing to do. Get a warm glow for supporting us, and the more people we have behind us, the louder and more authoritative our voice can be. So thank you very much, and have a lovely afternoon.